Hi everybody. So far we looked at objects at a very high level. There was a video and article I wrote called Of Pizza Types, Primitives, and Objects that touch upon the object-oriented nature of JavaScript, what objects bring to the table, and what makes them so powerful. But that article and video really just scratched the surface of what is possible here. And so we're going to go one level deeper in this video. We're going to learn more about how objects are, relook at them from a more technical angle, and then look at some of the more complicated techniques you need to understand really well to be able to use objects in JavaScript really effectively. And so what we're going to be doing is jumping between code and jumping between slides as part of making all this object exploration really happen. And so there's 6 parts to what we're going to be doing. One is learn how to create objects, learn how to add and read properties on them, we'll learn how to delete properties, and then we'll go into some of the more advanced topics around prototype inheritance, how to extend objects, and the meaning of the magical keyword this, which you might have seen in various examples you might have seen already in other projects or other code snippets already. So let's go ahead and get started. And so for this part, I'm going to go jump right into Visual Studio Code, start writing some examples on how to work with objects. So what I have here is a blank page. There's nothing going on here. It's just a blank HTML page where I have a script element added, and there's some boilerplate content to have the bare minimum up and running. And I've tiled my window so that I have the same page that I'm editing also available on the right hand side, so I can refresh and see what's going on. And right now this page is empty. If I refresh the page, nothing's going to happen. And the bulk of what we're going to be looking at really will not be anything visual in terms of on the DOM. It'll just be things printed to the console. And so it's going to be less exciting on that level, but that excitement though is going to be balanced, or the lack of excitement will be balanced by a lot of really cool details on how to start working with objects to be more productive. So let's go get started. And so here I am, I have my script tag, and I'm going to create an object. And I'm going to create an object, let's call it funny guy. Let funny guy, my variable declaration, and let's initialize it to these curly braces. Now, these curly braces are what tells JavaScript that what I'm working with here is going to be hopefully the beginnings of a nice object. And right now I have funny guy, it's an object, that's it. And so right now I've created an object, the curly braces are all that I needed to make this work. Now the contents of an object, what exactly goes inside them, are properties, and they're often in key value pairs where I have a property and the value it stores is something else. Now there are many ways of specifying properties, not many ways, maybe 2 or 3 ways, and we'll look at what those ways are right now. So the first approach we're going to look at is known as a dot notation approach. So I'll call it dot notation approach. I'm going to be using the code itself as a way of documenting what exactly it is that we're doing. I'm going to zoom in one more time to make it much larger. And so let's say that I want to create a property called first name, and since one of my favorite, let me back up a bit, one of my favorite comedians is Conan O'Brien. And so it has a first name Conan, last name O'Brien. And I want to have this funny guy object store both the first name and last name values with Conan O'Brien set respectively for each of them. And so I'm going to set the first name, I'm going to do funny guy. And with the dot notation approach, I just specify the dot, and the property I'm going to call is first name, and I'm going to set it equal to Conan. And this tells JavaScript that I have my funny guy object, it has a property called first name, value of Conan. And similarly, I'm going to go and set my last name as well. Funny guy, that last name equals O'Brien. And I have my last name specified as well. Now, if I want to see what the value is, I want to print this value out to the screen, all I can do is just do console.log and just read the value directly. So funny guy, if I can spell it correctly, funny guy dot first name and first name, and print to the screen. Let me refresh the page to see what's going to happen here. Refresh the page, you can see the word Conan being printed on screen. Similarly, I can do last name and I'll see O'Brien printed on screen as well. And if I look at what the object itself contains, I can just type in funny guy, and when I hit enter, you can see that what we basically store is the 2 properties, first name and last name that we created, and then you just see the values that go along with it as well. So this is one way of defining properties and reading values on them, and this is the dot notation approach. Let me comment these 2 lines out. And now there's another approach that we can use, and that is the bracket notation approach. And this is JavaScript, so you will have multiple ways of being able to do something that you could have just done in one way or another. In the bracket approach, we do same way, funny guy, and just like we do with like other objects like arrays, we specify the square brackets, and then we specify the property inside of it. And notice that the properties are almost always strings. And so in the newer version of JavaScript, there can be other things like a symbol, but for now we'll just say they're all going to be strings. And I'm going to say funny guy, bracket first name, and the first name is in quotation marks to indicate that it's a string, the text type of content, and specify Conan. And similarly, funny guy last name equals, just like before, O'Brien. Okay, and so if I want to print the value of this value out, all I have to do is just do my console.log, and instead of doing dot first name we did earlier, I can just do funny guy first name as follows, and then just go ahead and refresh the page, and you'll now see Conan being printed on screen. And similarly, if I just print out the value of funny guy, you'll see that the properties are defined exactly as we had them before. First name, last name, Conan and O'Brien are respectively the properties there. And just that you're probably wondering, like, do I have to read it by using the bracket syntax? Actually, you don't have to. You can use the dot syntax as well and be able to just refresh the page, and now you can see Conan being displayed on screen. You can even mix and match things as well. You can say funny guy dot last name equals Conan O'Brien, and you can read it by using the bracket syntax if that is exactly how you prefer to do that. And so let me go and do bracket last name and scroll that out, and you can now see O'Brien printed screen. Oh, uninspected syntax. Oh, I forgot to close the bracket. Good thing, errors are very helpful. You can see O'Brien printed screen directly as well. Okay, so the only reason I'm calling up both the dot notation and bracket notation is that there's some unique cases where one makes more sense over the other. And the reason you might use the bracket notation syntax is that you can actually evaluate the values that go inside of it. If for whatever reason you wanted to have the property be not just first name, but first plus, I'm going to create a variable called, title, and I'm going to have a variable called let title equals name. No idea why I would do that, but just bear with me here. I can do exactly this, and when funny guy is evaluated as a property, the first plus the value of title, which is name, gets evaluated, and you get ahead and get first name as the property name. So if I hit refresh, you'll see that, let me type in funny guy, and you can see first name displayed on the screen. Likewise, if I just name this to foo for whatever reason, I can go back and then I can say funny guy first foo is Conan, last name O'Brien. Now this makes a lot more sense if I have something like a loop, for example, and I'll go ahead and just kind of highlight what that might look like. Let me create an object. My object equals bracket bracket, nothing exciting going on there, and I do for let I equals 0, I equals less than 5, and I plus plus. And let me the property name equals data plus the value of I, so it'd be data 0, data 1, data 2, so on. And I can now create my object bracket property name, which is now going to get evaluated, equals math.random. No, just times 100. Why not? Just keep it very simple. All right, let me refresh this page. And now if I were to type in just my object, you'll now see that we have 4 properties here, data 0, data 1, data 2, data 3, and data 4, mapping what's available here. And that is very simple of being able to use a bracket syntax and able to pull that off with a dot notation. That might be a little more tricky. Now, the last thing we're going to look at in terms of like setting values is, what if I wanted to kind of just not do this with individually for a dot notation or bracket syntax? What if I kind of know out beforehand what my entire property will look like? Well, in that case, I can actually use the object notation syntax directly and just say let funny guy equals bracket. Let me just kind of get the structure going here. Type in first name, Conan, actually, comma, last name, O'Brien. And now if I go see what funny guy value is, let me refresh the page. Funny guy has already been declared. Oh, of course, one of the improvements, quote unquote, of the let syntax. If if I go funny guy, you now see the exact same values displayed without me having to display them initially. Now the only thing might be that, just like before, what if I want to have a property whose value is dynamically evaluated? Well, that's where the brackets come in again. So let me just do let custom equals occupation, close the bracket on it, and then I can, so if I just do custom, for example, right, custom, and then I put comedian, what this, on a certain level it kind of looks like, oh, this might need to work because custom is a property, I have a property for it there, it's going to do the right thing. Well, as it turns out, it doesn't. It's because the way JavaScript works is inside an object declaration, whatever the property value is, it's turned to a string and it just shows up here as a key, custom comedian. And so the way to evaluate to have it be occupation is to, just like before, use the bracket syntax, wrap it in a bracket, and now if I refresh the page, you now see that appropriately, you see first name, last name, and occupation, the evaluated value of custom, being displayed here. So that's an interesting way of looking at the bracket notation syntax used within the syntax for being able to set multiple properties and values at once, which you may end up using for cases where your data structure, what you're trying to do, is largely predefined for you. Just keep that in mind as a part of it. And of course, the way you access these values is just like you did before. You can do funny guy, and then be able to print it out like I've been able to show on screen. And the other also interesting thing is that your properties can be objects of their own. So it could be like, for example, I could even have things, for example, like, I don't know, what's a good property? Shapes. And then within the shape object, I can have a bracket, and then I can put like, title rectangle. Why I would do that in an object called funny guy, I have no idea, but it could just be that, show sitcom, whatever, things you want to do. And actually, why shapes and all this, ignore the concrete example, but the big thing to keep in mind is that you can create objects within your particular object itself, so you can have nested objects with a lot of things. And the way you access the value of a nested object is just by dotting through it. So funny guy dot shapes dot title is how I would get to it. So funny guy, shapes, title, and if I refresh this page, you now see that rectangle is what ultimately ends up being shown on screen. And so that's just one of the things you'll keep in mind when you're either seeing objects created in the wild or you're defining objects on your own, is that you can create really deeply nested structures. And that's one of the key capabilities of JSON objects, which is a separate video and article that describes what they do, where you have really complex values and data that you want to represent, all being able to be easily shown in JavaScript by using this nested object structure. So it's kind of pretty cool in that sense. Now, let's go and say we want to go ahead and remove some properties. How would we pull that off? The way you delete properties or remove properties, there are two ways of pulling this off. And in JavaScript, if you ever find yourself just having one way to do something, you need to dig deeper, because there's probably at least 2, 3, or even 10 more ways of being able to pull off the same thing. And there are reasons for that, so I'm not dissing on JavaScript in any way. So one of the best ways to delete a property is basically delete keyword. Delete funny guy dot first name. So when I do this, you'll now see that funny guy, the first name property, is completely deleted. So let me refresh this page. Let me type in funny guy. And now you'll see that only 2 properties are showing up, last name and occupation. They're both not. Then the first name property, it's almost as if it never existed. Now, there's a second approach, and that approach is where we set the value of this to be undefined. And so funny guy, the first name, let's take the delete keyword out, equals undefined. Now, this has the kind of capability of, when I do this, the first name property is still available, but now shows up as undefined. Now, this is not technically us removing the property, but the reason you might want to do this is you should definitely test this out on your own. But if you're doing a lot of manipulation and deleting and removing properties, you may find that it's pretty slow. The delete operation is not the fastest thing out there. Whereas if you set the property value to undefined, you can kind of tell JavaScript that this value is not really there, and the property still exists though. And so you kind of have to trade off this balance between, I can use delete, suffer the speed penalty, but have the property be completely removed, or I can set the value that I want to delete just undefined, in which case I gain the speed, or I don't lose more speed, but I do have to carry on the extra memory and the baggage of this property still being existing on my object. And so that's one of the things to kind of keep in mind as part of choosing how you want to delete your properties. And so now we've kind of gotten to this point where where's my keynote? And And so now we kind of looked at the big three things here: creating objects, adding and reading properties, and deleting properties. So that is really the fundamentals of how we work with objects, and that carries over to more complex objects we'll be looking at later, like arrays and strings and numbers and things that kind of take our existing basic fundamental object and go a whole lot deeper. So now we're going to look at the flip side. If we look at what we're looking at was the surface level work of what objects do, the top part of the iceberg in many ways. Now we're going to go underwater and look at the much bigger, complicated pieces under the hood that really make objects work the way they do. And so the part that we're going to go deeper into is this. We covered the basics, is that the way objects work is that they are related to other objects, and we'll be building objects based on other objects and doing what are known as traditional object-oriented things. And one of the key players in making that happen is this mysterious property, and it's known as prototype. And it's not just prototype with like a normal word you might see here. It's bracket, bracket, capital P, prototype, and then the bracket, bracket again. It looks really bizarre, but it is there because it is special, and it is something that is really called out as something that we need to keep in mind because it doesn't work and behave like a traditional property would do. And so we're going to take a deeper look at what this mysterious creature of the deep actually does. So let's say, I'm in the console and I have a funny guy object, and you can see it's completely empty, right? And if I just type in funny guy and I type in the dot to see what are all the properties I come up with, notice that it's not empty. You don't just see the empty object, you see constructor, has own property, is property of, property is enumerable, and so on coming in. Where's it coming from? I never defined it. My funny guy object here is empty. There's no property, there's no first name, last name. It's completely empty. Where exactly is it coming from? And this is where the prototype property comes in. If we take a step back and look at what an object in JavaScript is, there's the part that we define, which is the object itself. And then there's the part behind the scenes that JavaScript provides that helps the object do all the various things it does. And every object will have that. And in the case of a generic object like we have right now, that object is known as Object.prototype. And this is an object that in many ways is part of this link where you go from what I created to the actual implementation that contains all the capabilities I need. And the way this mapping happens is that the object we created, funny guy, has a property called prototype, and that points to Object.prototype. And that in its own way is a pretty complex chunk of code that contains the constructor property and has its own property and so on. So when we go into something and say we're going to dot into the funny guy, we're not only dotting in and looking at the properties of the object we're on right now, we're navigating through the entire prototype chain. And this is known as a prototype chain here, where I have one link here, and it points to a second link, which is Object prototype, and I enumerate and list all the properties that the prototype exposes until I reach the point where there is no more links in the chain for me to go to. Because object is pretty fundamental and it's very basic, there's only one level of linking that happens, where I go from my object to the Object prototype, and so that's all that really happens. Then everything else kind of just, ends at that point because there's nothing more primitive. It's almost like we go from an atomic level and beyond atoms. There really isn't anything meaningful for us to look at as we go into the quantum world, but we're not going to do that right now. And so let's say I type in like funnyguy.toString. How does this whole thing work? The way it works is exactly by navigating the chain. In this case, toString does not exist on my prototype, but JavaScript doesn't go like, okay, let's throw an error, it doesn't exist. It says, okay, it doesn't exist on my object, but let me navigate through the prototype and see if it exists somewhere else. And in this case, it goes through Object.prototype, and it sees that, okay, I see constructor, has one property, so, but I see toString here, and toString works, so I'm going to go ahead and say, yep, toString works, and I can do something with it. And that is the typical approach for being able to work between prototypes and properties and having them navigate between each other. And there, if this isn't too confusing already, the one thing to note is that object that itself is not a part of the prototype chain. And the reason that it plays a role in how objects implement the relationship between what's known as a constructor property and another really poorly named property known as prototype, which is not the same as the bracket prototype. So when you see this object that I call out here, often I fade it out, ignore that for now. It's there because of just some complicated relationship between the constructor and I'm including it only for thoroughness, but not because I'm going to show that this object plays a critical role right now in how this code works. The only thing to worry about for object is you have your object to create, and then you have the prototype property that then does all these extra things that make objects work. So let's say I have funny guy, and I have first name, last name, Conan O'Brien, just like the code we saw earlier. If I look at the visualization of this from the prototype chain, what you'll see is this. Funny guy has two properties, first name and last name, which is defined properly on it. And then the prototype goes and you can see all the properties that are included alongside with it. And look similarly, let's say that, I create multiple objects. I create, I call funny guy, Conan O'Brien, the dude, Jeffrey Lebowski, and detective Adrian Monk. And you can see that each of these objects has two properties that are all set on them, first name, last name. And it also has a method. It's a getName property whose value is a function that has some capabilities to return name is, and and returns the first and last name when you were to call this. Now, in this case, you can see that there's some room for optimization. I've been copying and pasting a lot of values, and why am I duplicating some of these things? Like, could there be a way where I can have a more common version of something? And this gets us into one of the real highlights and benefits of just object-oriented programming and the twist that JavaScript provides with prototypical and prototype inheritance. And there's something I want to first mention beforehand, is that if you look at this code and how it looks, here's what you'll see. You'll see three objects created, funny guy, the dude, and detective. They each carry with them the three properties that are defined on them. They all point to Object.prototype, which is the common ancestor in the case of what's happening here, and they contain all the properties that are going along with it. Now, this part is critical to note. Not each of these objects do not have their own copy of Object.prototype. Nope. They point to the existing singular instance of Object.prototype instead. So it's not a case where each of these objects has their own world of prototypes that then happen to live in their own parallel universe. They all share the same one. So any modification made to prototype will automatically reflect on any of these objects and what they might rely on from it. And that is critical because if we want to reduce some of the duplication of the code that we saw here, one of the ways we can do that is by creating an intermediate object that they all share resources and properties from. And what to look like is this. If a property and object will perform a unique task on each object, keeping those separate makes sense. We don't want to have an intermediate object that contains very unique things on it. But if a property performing a common task, consolidating them into a single object will save memory. Now, these words right now may not make sense, so let's try to help make them make more sense by looking at an actual example. So going back to our code, we can see that the first name and last name are very much unique on each object. There's no object that has the same value for them. But the getName property, the function that replies to it, is duplicated. It's exactly the same. Maybe this is a great candidate for something we can consolidate into a single object. Now, what we want to do is this. I'm going to do the visual first. We have funny guy, we have the dude, we have the detective, and they each carry with them their own unique first name and last name properties. But they now share from an intermediate person object, which contains getName. So that way, instead of duplicating getName multiple times, it only exists on this person object, and that way I don't have to worry too much about having to make a modification to getName and then replicate across all these things. And of course, as typical inheritance goes, then the common ancestor for the person object is our Object.prototype, which earlier was the direct ancestor. Now it is a one level removed from what we are ultimately creating. And the way we can do that, there are several ways, and we're going to look at one way in this example. We're going to create a person object. I said let person equals my person object, and I'm declaring it all fully inline, and I have getName function, her name is so-and-so. Just create the person object by itself doesn't really do much. You just have an object. What I need to do is associate that object with as the ancestor of my prototype. And the way you do that is by using Object.create. So here I'm doing let funny guy equals Object.create person, just like the dude has also person as its common ancestor, and then specify the properties on each of these three objects, funny guy, the dude, and detective, without having to worry too much about where the duplication will be coming from, because the only common area is person, which they all ultimately inherit from as part of that. And what this means is this: if I go back to my person object and then I go ahead and add another property, in this case get initials, and I also make it a function that has all these extra things, every object that I normally would have worked with earlier that inherits from this will automatically get it as well, because this property get initials will live, as you might guess it, in the person object itself. So where I have get name right now, get initials will be appearing just below it, and that means funny guy, the dude, and detective can have access to get initials without each of them having to modify themselves to make all of that work, which is a great advantage because this decouples my implementation from having to worry about each copy needing to be modified, as opposed to just having a central source, central choke point be the one that is the primary area we update. And this is also where the last topic we're going to be covering, the this keyword, comes from. You might have seen the previous code, I use the this keyword a lot. Like get name includes the name is this.first name and this.last name. Now, why is this important? Why am I doing that? Now, the thing to keep in mind is this. I create an object called space guy, and it's object create person, again extending from the person object, and it's the first name to Buzz, last name to Lightyear. And then I'm constantly logging space guy.getName, and then Buzz Lightyear gets printed to the screen. So this code works. It's not a trick. The code works exactly the way it does. Buzz Lightyear gets printed to the screen. Now let's take a look at what exactly is going on in terms of this. I'm calling getName on space guy, even though space guy by itself does not have getName defined on it. It's defined on person, which is the object that I have here where getName and getInitials are there. So here I'm looking at this person object and the full product chain associated with it. And now when I call this.first name and this.last name, it magically knows to get the right value, even though person by itself does not have the first name or last name properties. And that is because the value of this is bound to the object I initially created the entire chain from, which in this case is space guy. So even though I am calling this.first name and last name on the person object, this is actually referring to space guy itself. And that's how I'm able to jump where get name only knows what's inside here, but this keyword tells it, oh, by the way, don't look at your own scope to see what the value of first name and last name is. Go to where this is pointing, which is space guy, and that's a first name and last name are printed. And so that explains how by using this you can kind of avoid this world where I need to carry along history everywhere I go. Nope, that this always points to the object I'm currently pointing to, scope to that particular area, and that means that any property I access knows where to start looking if it needs to look appropriately from it. So wow, we covered a lot of ground here, and I do apologize. It was very deep in some sections, but very quickly in some sections as well. But the more you see this, the more you play with this, the more you practice it, the better you'll get, because everything we do in JavaScript from here on out will use one, two, or all of these concepts in multiple creative ways to end up creating the final app or capability you're trying to build. And so take a look at the video at the bottom where I have links in the description to articles, other videos, and things that will just help you become more well-rounded in becoming an expert in working with objects in JavaScript, whether you're just creating properties and just setting some values on them, or going deeper and using all the prototype inheritance knowledge to be able to create really advanced things. And this also sets you up for our subsequent videos where we talk about very specific objects that do a lot of interesting work. And also we look at the class syntax, which is the more modern way of being able to work with objects and do inheritance and do extending objects and things like that. So it's really this is really the gateway, a really complicated gateway, but an important gateway to get you into fully deep down into JavaScript and objects and all the fun stuff that goes along with it. If you have any questions about objects or JavaScript or just anything web development in general, post in the forums at forum.group.com, where I and others, almost 200,000 others, will be happy to help answer any questions you might have. If you like this article, like this video, tell your friends and enemies all about it. Hit subscribe to be notified of new content I create. Follow me at Group on Twitter. Buy my book if you like reading this in text form or watching videos of it. A lot also exists in book form as well, in paperback and Kindle editions. This particular topic is covered heavily by JavaScript Absolute Beginner's Guide, also listed here. But any of my other books are also pretty interesting if you want to go deeper into other parts of just web development in general. And with that, I will see you all next time.